Hello everyone again. As the first part 1 mentioned about the greatest pandemic in human history, today I will continue sharing what happened after Taubenberger, and the study authors have deciphered the mystery. Spanish flu virus is actually a subtype of the H1n1 virus, infecting poultry. The danger is that the Spanish flu virus doesn't need to be hybridized with human flu to infect us. It can jump directly from birds to humans and make us sick. Tests on mice showed that the H1n1 virus that caused the Spanish flu is extremely dangerous. It could replicate 39,000 times more viruses than today's flu strains. Once the infection is successful, the virus will live in a variety of cells including lung and bronchial cells, leading to secondary infection and sickness. In a 2007 study, scientists infected monkeys with the Spanish flu virus, thereby successfully reproducing the typical symptoms documented from the 1918 pandemic. Monkeys died of a cytokine storm. The immune system overreacted, producing too many white blood cells and inflammatory cytokines. To fight off viruses, white blood cells attacked healthy cells and killed the host. This explains why young people, who have the strongest immune system, are more likely to die from the disease if infected. This also complements another theory that explains why older people, who have been previously exposed to a different strain of H1n1 flu, have somehow trained their immune systems against the Spanish flu virus. In contrast, younger people living in 1918 had an immune blind spot. Only those who were 28 or older had a single exposure to the Russian flu virus in 1890, an H3 strain with a completely different genetic structure. What about the origin of the Spanish flu virus? To this day it is still an unanswered question. We know that there is a huge amount of viruses that parasitize on animals like bats, wild birds, monkeys, etc. They are called zoonoses. The rate of cross-contamination from zoonosis to human is very low, but once it happens, disaster will be triggered. We have the Ebola pandemic, when the virus jumped from bats to humans. Zika broke out when the virus was transmitted from monkeys. Even the HIV/AIDS epidemic started from such a cross-contamination. The Spanish flu virus is no exception. It is a strain of bird flu. According to the theory put forward by the British virologist John Oxford, a wild bird carrying flu virus has migrated near the mouth of the Somme River in Étaples of Boulogne, France. Here, the virus had all the conditions necessary to infect humans and causes an outbreak. An environment for wild waterfowl. A population of chickens and pigs. Barracks where 100,000 British soldiers were stationed under dirty and stuffy trench conditions. As a result, in the winter of 1917, hundreds of British soldiers became ill with flu-like symptoms. The medical team at Étaples recorded 156 deaths. At that time, the disease was called purulent bronchitis. But when comparing the symptoms, the scientists found that the soldiers also turned purplish pale, especially on the lips, ears, and cheeks because of oxygen deficiency. Features of the Spanish flu. We are still not sure, but it was most likely the way that the most dangerous pandemic in history has begun. A century after the greatest pandemic, we can rest assured when the Spanish flu virus is definitely extinct in the natural environment. Even the corpses preserved in permanent ice since 1918 could not contain live viruses. Taubenberger confirmed. But some genes of the H1n1 strain causing Spanish flu still continue to spread among its descendants, including the H3n2 virus that caused Hong Kong flu pandemic in 1968. The H1n1 that caused the 2009 swine flu pandemic. Quote, "The 1918 pandemic has established a very successful human infection mechanism for the avian influenza virus, and it has never disappeared in the last 100 years. The Spanish flu is really the mother of all pandemics." And a quote. Statistics show that, on average, people will face an influenza pandemic every 30 years. After the Spanish flu pandemic in 1918-1919, was the raging of Asian flu, 1957 to 1958, Hong Kong flu, 1968-1969, and swine flu 2009. These are the three pandemics, ranked above other smaller flu epidemics like the H5n1 avian flu in Asia in 2006-2007. Despite having a lot of experience accumulated from all the influenza pandemics, scientists still believe that humanity will never be ready to face a potentially deadly flu virus on a global scale like the 1918 pandemic. If a similar flu virus breaks out again, Scenarios simulated by computers show that it would still cause a devastating destruction. More than 300,000 Americans would die.
The death toll worldwide could rise to 150 million.
In 1918, humanity's weakness was that we had to face the war. Influenza viruses proved to be very dangerous in battlefield conditions, with filthy trenches and mold. Then an economic recession left a high proportion of the population malnourished and easily affected. And when doctors were all drafted to the front lines to take care of the soldiers, hospitals and healthcare systems at home didn't have enough capacity to stop the pandemic. 100 years later, when we are living in a relatively peaceful world, with developed economy and upgraded healthcare systems, however, the challenges that we face are demographic change, urbanization, commercial aviation development, antibiotic resistance, and climate change. Dr. Caroline van der Sant of the Peter Doherty Institute for Immunology at the University of Melbourne said, "Right now, we are facing new challenges including aging population and people living with obesity and diabetes." Van der Sant and her team analyzed the data on the Spanish flu, Asian flu, Hong Kong flu, 1968, and swine flu, 2009 outbreaks. They predicted that the next flu pandemic would be very likely caused by a strain of avian influenza that can infect humans. The spreading speed will be very rapid and globally via air travel. There are many favorable conditions for this pandemic to surpass the Spanish flu in 1918. A new study, published in the Frontiers in Cellular and Infection Microbiology journal, said that the next pandemic could flare up and spread throughout the developed world, when a high proportion of the population is facing obesity and diabetes. Quote, "What we know from the 2009 pandemic is that people with certain illnesses, such as obesity and diabetes, are more likely to be hospitalized and die from flu," said Kirsty Short, from the University of Queensland. The team warns that the world will continue to face a double burden, as malnutrition is still common in poor countries. Global warming may also affect the pandemic in a different way. Van der Sant said that many strains of influenza come from birds, therefore, when the planet is warmed, the pattern of infection will change, catching us by surprise. Climate change is changing the pattern of bird migration, bringing latent viruses to new places and potentially turning many bird species into hosts, she said. Antibiotic resistance is also a problem. Most of the victims died in the 1918 influenza pandemic were due to secondary bacterial infections, which antibiotics have helped to reduce in subsequent pandemics. But bacteria are becoming increasingly more resistant to antibiotics. Catherine Kedzierska, from the University of Melbourne's Doherty Institute, said, "This increases the risk of dying from secondary infections in the next outbreak when it comes." What about vaccines? It is a race against time. In general, it is impossible to predict which strain of the virus will cause the next pandemic. Because if that was the case, then scientists would have been able to develop a specific vaccine to prevent the next flu strain and go to bed early. However, influenza A alone has about 144 subtypes, continuously changing each year, not to mention influenza B, C, and D. Scientists cannot create a vaccine that is unique and permanently specific to all of these strains. All they can do is to monitor the mutations each year and create the best vaccine, which is relatively effective for next year's flu season. This vaccine is unlikely to protect against all strains of influenza and may completely lose its effectiveness for the year after. So, for the most part, the script will go like this. People try to create vaccines to prevent the most risky strains of influenza, but there will be a strain of flu beyond the effectiveness of the vaccine that can evolve into an epidemic. Supermarkets, climate change, and the popularity of commercial aviation will facilitate the virus's spread. Meanwhile, antibiotic resistance, poverty in less developed countries, and obesity, diabetes in developed countries will increase the death toll. With the latest technology, it would still take pharmaceutical companies 3 to 6 months to produce vaccines against new strains of influenza. During that time, humanity simply does not have any protection other than wearing a mask, limiting going to crowded places, and washing hands frequently. When being asked about what she thought of a new flu pandemic, Ada said, "At my age, there's no need to worry. But the new flu pandemic will be a major concern for the generation of my grandchildren. The world is so different from 100 years ago. Now, people kiss so often and naturally. Kisses can spread the virus. I even see men hugging each other dearly. Nobody does that in 1918.